Welcome back. Judy, Converse, Therese, Nadler here, registered dietitians for Pediatrics. Today we are going to talk about allergies. A lot to unpack here. Just in general, there's many levels to allergies and allergic reactions. So we are going to dive in, sort of take it from the top. And I think, just to put a little disclaimer out there, this is educational. This is not diagnostic, what we're doing. It's always important if you suspect your child has an allergy to work with a pediatric allergist or immunologist when needed. But I will say, given our years of practice and sort of what we've seen, I think that allergies are very wily, is what I is the best way to describe it. Because when you go to see an allergist, you have to have such an extreme reaction to register what they would consider an allergic reaction. But I think for many people, there are subclinical reactions happening on a daily basis to different inputs, particularly when it comes to food. Um, so let's talk, I guess, a little bit about that. If it is a good way to kick it off, what do you think?
Perfect. Yeah. And gosh, I would say, I don't know, a huge part of my practice, my pediatric nutrition practice for over 25 years was talking about this very topic.
Yeah,
Parents would come in really frustrated because there's symptoms, and we say the word subclinical, but they're pretty clinical. They're pretty evident. They're
physical
pretty upfront.
manifestation. Yeah,
And
yeah,
it kind of falls into that subclinical zone because they don't necessarily fit the recipe, if you will, for what your MD allergist has been taught to
yeah,
regard as an allergy.
right,
Fair enough, he's that's a reaction that's going to look very swift and very severe. So
yeah,
you're talking about carrying an EpiPen. Your kid might suddenly vomit, have hives, the tingling. We're all pretty familiar with that. And that's
right.
dangerous. And that is important. You can have varying classifications and it's called IgE, immunoglobulin E, being the antibody that's going to kind of show up with that reaction. That's what your allergist will look at. And even within that, you can have a low grade reaction that looks what you might call subclinical to
Yeah,
something, any food. Uh, or you might have that real obvious, boy, my kid's got to carry the EpiPen. But the story doesn't end there, right? As we know, there's so many other ways. Our immune systems are very complex. And when you said allergies are wily, so are our immune systems. They're very complex. I could not begin to claim to understand that in its entirety. And I don't know if anyone really does. We're constantly learning about that. But yeah, we can talk about what's an intolerance, what's an allergy, and what's a sensitivity. Maybe we should start there.
yeah, absolutely. I think that's
So
good.
yeah, allergy would be, and this is the thing to get tested if you see really persisting signs in your kid, and that can look like a lot of things. Like we said, it can be that big dramatic reaction, but it can also
Right.
be irritable stool pattern or a funky stool pattern or sort of a curious mercurial up and down stomach pain when you can't quite pin is it related to a food or not. It can even be behavioral.
Yeah, see a
It
lot of that.
can look like say a child with asthma, but their asthma symptoms worsen and it's not a GI looking thing. So I've seen all of the above. And in my opinion, all of that warrants a test with your allergist for the classic IgE food reaction. They can do either a skin prick test
Yep.
or a blood test to measure how much of that immunoglobulin E reacts to food. They can measure histamine levels. They can measure tryptase levels. There's all ways they have to see, is your immune system flipping out over something? And they can work with that. So that's the classic allergy. Vomiting, hives, diarrhea can all look like that.
Yeah.
Um,
And I do think the histamine is actually,
mhm.
I see that a lot, in general. And histamine's complex because there are foods that are high in histamine, there are foods that are histamine liberating foods. So
Right.
it's multi-layered. And we can talk about that in more depth. But I think in general, the body, the immune system is it's like overreacting to something,
Right.
and
It's
it's
setting alarm bells off when it really, it shouldn't,
right, right. And it's the hard part, especially when it comes to food, is really trying to pinpoint what is creating some of these issues for your system, if you don't register like such a strong response that like an allergist would be able to pick it up.
Yeah. So exactly. And you mentioned high histamine foods.
Yeah.
all foods have a little bit of histamine in them. And I want to say histamine's a really important part of our immune system's function. It's not bad. It's
Yeah.
only bad if you've got way too much of it and your immune system is overstimulated. There's um, a condition called mast cell activation syndrome or
Yeah.
MCAS.
MCAS.
And that's something that allergists are getting clued in on. Some GI doctors are as well to look at, well, what is driving
The
that?
trigger, right?
A food may be a trigger. What's under it might be some kind of chronic latent infection burden, a viral burden, whatever that can keep the
Yeah.
immune system over engaged, if you will, if that's a right word for it. But yeah, it's true. It's like why looking at why the immune system is doing that. Your allergist isn't really going to solve that problem for you generally. What they want to make sure is you're safe and you're not going to have
At
a
risk.
real emergency event. So they can give you
Right.
medications for things like that. But they're generally not going to dig deeper and go, well, you know what's underneath this is you've got this ancient fungal and viral burden in your tissue. They're not going to look at that. But that's,
Right.
I think, where in my practice, where I would go looking to see, well, we've got a really chronic situation here. It's been dogging you for years. You've tried special diets. Your kid's got a lot of eczema, no solutions. Then we can look under the hood a little bit more and go, wait, let's get more diagnostics in here and
Right.
work with your doctor and whatnot. But
And
yeah,
not treat things in isolation. I mean, that's the other thing.
right.
It's a root cause systems approach.
Exactly. And food can really help with that. And food, yes, elimination diets can really help. I would always encourage parents not to overdo that because it's no fun and it's
No,
hard
it's
and it
very
makes
hard.
everybody kind of sad. But you can also feel a lot better. So that's another quick shout out. Like, don't think you necessarily have to go on this extreme. I'm taking everything out of the diet. I ran into a lot of that. But let's talk about just these other reactions. So there's that allergy story where for some reason your immune system is throwing off the alarms in a big obvious way. Your allergist might identify what trips the alarms for you, and it's not going to necessarily identify the source of the fire, if you will. If you want to think of something in the background smoldering in the immune system and something trips it off, they're going to be able to give you some medications to help manage it, which can be life-saving, which can be really helpful for some. But then we can talk about getting into these other reactions. So there's food intolerances,
Yep.
and then there's food sensitivities. So an intolerance is something that generally we think about in terms of not triggering immune response, but it can get confused with that. I ran into this a lot, even among other providers who aren't really trained in nutrition. So an example of an intolerance would be like a lactose intolerance. And I had a lot of people come to me saying, "Oh, I have a lactose allergy or a milk allergy." And what we really would find is they just don't have the enzyme to break down lactose. That's all. And
So
it's
it's
not,
resolvable if you add
yeah,
like digestive
lactase.
enzymes or
You take
lactase.
some
Right. Yep.
lactase. It's
Yep.
really easy to test by giving somebody some lactase to eat with a meal that has lactose in it, which is the carbohydrate in dairy food.
Yep.
And there's not a lot of it in yogurt. There is a lot of it in milk or ice cream.
Yep.
Anything fermented a longer time is going to have the lactose go down because that's the food source for the fermentation. So some people would come in, my kid can eat some yogurt, but they can't have ice cream, So
Yeah.
it's easy to differentiate that. That's not
And
an allergy. That's not an immune response.
and is that's typically like diarrhea? Like what is the symptom, right,
Yeah,
that
you're
would
going to
run through?
feel pretty bloated, uncomfortable, gas pain,
Yeah.
and gas and diarrhea might
Yeah.
ensue from that. And um, that's not an allergy. I even would hear from other physician or nurse or other folks on the care teams confusing that with allergy. That doesn't mean your kid necessarily has to avoid all dairy food. So
Mm-hmm.
that's easy. Um, Anything that you might consider in another type of intolerance, it can have an immune component, and that gets a little tricky. And we've talked before on this podcast about these casomorphins,
Mm-hmm.
which is if you think of milk protein, which is one of them is casein, and say they don't get very well digested for whatever reason, your gut is impaired in terms of how well it will take apart casein,
Yeah.
and you end up with this partly digested milk protein molecule called casomorphin. That's going to have a really big impact if you have a lot of it in your gut. It will affect behavior, it will affect your bowel movements. Uh, that's an intolerance also. That's not necessarily an immune piece. That's once again a weak digestion story. And we can differentiate all that stuff. Um, Phenols and salicylates, that's another one. Food colors, dyes, those aren't necessarily allergies. Those are,
Yep.
yeah, that's another story of what is your GI tract and your liver doing to take apart those funky compounds. And if they're stacked up to a certain level, your child's going to look like they're reacting. So that's that's kind of a murky zone for your allergist. They're not going to look at those things.
Yeah.
That's not really their purview. Um, but yeah, some intolerances can happen with immune involvement, some without. Um, the histamine release is also one. You might have, say, a big story when your child eats strawberries, which is I think is a higher histamine food, and they look all flush, or they eat tomatoes, or they eat some pork you made 2 days ago. It's in the fridge, you reheat it, and they have a big histamine reaction.
And just to
That
clarify, leftovers, what you're referencing there is leftovers. So basically,
exactly.
leftovers for a day or two build up histamine.
They
So if you
do.
are
Thank you.
histamine sensitive, you want to kind of eat fresh food or you want to freeze it right away and then
Mhm.
defrost it as opposed to like eating leftovers 5 days later.
Especially meats. Proteins are going to
The
have
proteins,
more of that.
fish, yeah, they'll build
Yeah.
up a lot more.
Yeah. So that might, let's say you then go to your allergist and you say, I think my kid's allergic to strawberries and pork and whatnot. And it's negative IgE testing. So that doesn't mean there's not a reaction. It might be a very different kind of reaction that they didn't measure.
Yeah.
And there's solutions around that too. So I want to also talk about food sensitivity. So that's different. It's where you've got another type of antibody reacting, and it's called IgG. And your allergist doesn't generally measure that. And it's more of a delayed reaction, but it can be pretty profound,
Yeah.
right? And this is where we were talking earlier about like the shiners. Maybe your kid gets a lot of colds, sinus infections. Um,
Eczema, skin issues,
Skin issues, eczema, kind of irritable bowel. Sometimes it's fine, sometimes it's crazy messy. They might have migraines. That's a biggie.
headaches. Yeah.
Kids who came in with migraines, often I would find they had a gluten sensitivity, not a wheat allergy, not celiac disease, but they were making enough antibody when they ate gluten or wheat that it would trigger a migraine that evening.
And it's
So,
funny because when kids are young enough, they can't really verbalize also that they have a headache, but you'll see them like holding their head or like you'll notice that they're doing something like the head feels heavy and they're holding it or
yeah, yeah.
something like that. Yeah.
Yeah, another big sign that would go with a gluten sensitivity in kids would be much more anxiety,
Mm,
difficulty focusing, a
yeah.
lot more sensory dysregulation. So this is the kid who can't sit still
Sit
to eat a
still.
meal, or if they run into a funny texture, they leave the table, or they can't stand the smell of food, or they can't see other people eating, or all these kind of sensory overload things is a common flag that I would run into with a food sensitivity. And as dietitians, we can run some lab tests, and I could run a food sensitivity panel. We should talk about the kind of the pushback that is typical.
Well, and I was also going to say, okay, so food sensitivity panels, oftentimes what I have observed is you will come back with a bunch of flags like react to nuts, react to eggs, like albumin and, the yolk, you react to gluten, you react to dairy, right? So then what's left as a parent? You're like, okay, my kid is going to have to eat grilled chicken and vegetables, which neither of which they particularly love.
We're not going to eat.
So
Right.
let's talk
So
about the food sensitivity panel because it can be, you can get it back and it can be like, oof,
shoot,
what
right? That's
now?
a really
Right.
good thing to talk about. So yeah, these panels, the on the upside, it's a very small amount of blood sample, and it'll look
Right.
at nearly 100 different foods. On the downside, it's usually out of pocket expense. Insurance doesn't typically cover it. Okay, I'm going to go back to the upside and say, but it can get you a lot of information in one shot, and
Directionally. Yeah.
it tells me a lot. And and then, like you said, it can feel overwhelming to see a panel all lit up. So what do you do with that? What you definitely don't do is eliminate all the foods on the panel. And I saw this mistake a lot. Parents would come in and say, my naturopath told me not to eat. And I'm like, that's unreasonable. That's not going to work. If I see a panel all lit up like that, what I know is this child has a gut permeability issue. There's an
Right.
issue there, and it's too permissive. These food proteins that are not the entire protein molecule, but there's fragments of these proteins circulating in the blood, and the immune system
And
is
they should not be
flagging.
there. Yeah,
Shouldn't
correct.
be there. The gut should be functioning
Field.
better. So
Yeah.
this is a gut issue.
Right.
And that's a whole other podcast we could talk about. But it doesn't say to me, oh, you need to remove all the foods. So what I would typically do is look at two factors. One, let's say you're showing a reactive food. What are the two pieces I look at? One, how often do you eat it?
Yeah.
And how high is the reaction? So it'll give you a little scale.
Yeah.
Let's say you have a really high reaction to oranges and you eat them once a week. Who cares? If you can eat the orange once a week and it's not going to throw your kid completely, you don't notice behaviorally or pain or what, okay, eat an orange now and then. If you have a really high reaction to a food your child eats 3 times a day, okay, we need to work with
Right.
that because 3 times a day you are pounding that immune system
Immune
and
system.
reminding it to turn on, turn on, turn on.
And
Yeah,
I will say, just like observationally, it's often the foods that the kids eat the most of
of course,
that are
right?
the biggest problem. So even just when I do a food log intake, I'm like, oh, lots of carbs, or like, oh, tons of dairy, or like even, oh, only carbs and dairy. You know what I mean? It's like,
Yeah,
and then you have behavior issues and you have, let's say, red shiners under the eyes and a history of eczema, right? So you're piecing together like, okay, this kid is likely reacting, you know what I mean,
right.
to these things. And then it puts them on that like craving circuit for the crunchy, salty, sweet, you know what I mean? And they can't get off it.
Yeah, right. So it's a matter of that process of sorting
Yeah.
which foods are the biggest offenders. And by biggest, I mean you're eating them the most often and they're have the highest reaction.
Yeah.
And typically what my approach would be, we're going to replace, I would kind of max out at 4 of the foods. I wouldn't, it was rare that I would go further. If I really needed to go further, I'd start bringing in some other tools, elemental formulas and things that really work
Yeah.
well to help that gut tissue restore
Heal.
itself
Yeah.
without eliminating so much food that your child starts getting malnourished.
Right.
So
I
that
mean,
we,
that's the other piece, right? Because oftentimes you have kids that are picky eaters. So then when you're like, oh, let's remove, a major source of what they're eating, and they're so picky, they're
yeah,
not willing, they're not open to,
yeah, they won't do it
alternative.
for you. You have to do
Right.
it for them. They're not going to go, thanks, I'll eat this almond milk with collagen in it instead of dairy. They're
And
not going
just
to do
love
that.
it. Right.
Yeah, not going to happen. But yeah, so it's that process of how can you use food to restore this scenario? And we had the GAPS chef on earlier, and
Yep.
that's a way for a lot of families that's just out of reach. It's just beyond reach for them.
Hard. Yeah.
Um, there's other ways that can get your kid much happier and tolerating more food. I've seen that happen hundreds of times. The other foundation, of course, under that is gut microbiome, and I know we'll get to a podcast about that, gut microbiome, and what are the really my favorite go-to tools for gut tissue rest, really repair and addressing that permeability story. So that's what the food sensitivity story is. And as far as, oh, those only show what you eat, I have a great example of how that is not true. And I saw this many times in my practice, but I did have, and I've mentioned before, I had a set of twins, a boy and a girl. The boy was on the spectrum, autism spectrum. The sister was neurotypical. They ate pretty much the same foods. The boys' panel and the girls' panel were night and day.
Interesting.
Everything on that boys' panel was lit up. That
Yeah.
girls' panel was like a poster perfect, no issue. And that's the difference. One child's gut is, quote, leaky gut, which is, higher permeability story. And the other child's gut was intact and healthy.
Right.
So what happens over time is your immune system just starts tagging and flagging these things. And I want to point out too, allergists and physicians in general, at least in my experience, they didn't like this test, at least in general. In the functional universe, different story. They would claim that, yeah, this is pretty much just what you eat. What's so curious about that perspective that these tests can't be valid is that in medicine, of course, when we want to see if someone's immune to something, what do we check? We check for an IgG antibody, which is like your immune system's memory. Like, oh, I had that infection, now I'm immune. You're going to have a chickenpox IgG. You're going to have, um, you know, various flu types. You're going to have an antibody that shows that the person testing you, the doctor, whatever, you have had this infection and your immune system knows what to do if it sees it again. It shouldn't do that with food. And
Right.
the fact that you can capture a lot of IgG reactions from food doesn't mean it's not real. It's just as real as your body saying, I had chicken pox. And it's just as, you know, it's going to keep triggering the more you eat that food every day. So we don't
Right.
dismiss it in our practices as dietitians.
And then there's also crossover reactions. I mean, like dairy and gluten have similar protein structure, right? So your body may react to gluten, but unfortunately, if you react to gluten, chances are you're going to react to dairy too,
Yes,
often.
I often met I would run into cases of true celiac where they wouldn't progress till they also removed dairy. That casein protein looked a little too much like the gluten uh, base molecule to not react. So
Right. And the
yeah.
body's not perfect, right? It
Hmm.
flags, you know what I mean? It flags things incorrectly sometimes, but that
Hmm.
those are two that are very common. Um, and then I forget there's another one with the skin of apples, right? That cross reacts with pollen. There's like fruit skins that react with pollen. I can't remember exactly which one it is, but so there's cross reactivity and it's the
Right.
body is not perfect.
That's so true. The immune system is that's its job is to kind of scan and sort. I mean, and do I pay
Yeah.
attention to this or not?
Right.
So it's kind of like an ADD for the immune system,
Yeah.
um, which is interesting because I'm working with a lot of kids with ADD and ADHD often had a lot of active food sensitivities, and they just are like wiggly, can't focus, have explosive behavior, or stuff like that. So
Yeah.
interesting. It is being able to settle, calm, and sort and not overreact. So
Yeah.
I think let's talk about some of the ways that you begin to navigate this. Um, I I think one of the first things that is useful is to get the standard allergy testing done. So you discover is there a big story here? I mean, you can have IgE reactions that are they don't necessarily perfectly linearly correlate with that number, the reaction. And so what I mean to say is, let's say you have a class 5 peanut reaction, and it's a high number on the test, and you carry an EpiPen, but then one day your kid accidentally peanut and they were kind of okay. So I've seen that, not to encourage you to not carry your
Yeah.
EpiPen.
Right, right.
But then on the flip side, I've seen a low number to something like wheat. And boom, there was hives. And so there's some kind of voodoo in there that
Yeah, where
that
the number might not correlate with the
might not
reaction is what
correlate.
you're saying. Yeah.
Exactly. And another biggie where that is really often true is a situation called food protein induced enterocolitis syndrome, or FPIES.
Yeah.
Usually you'll see it really early in babies and toddlers. And early on in understanding that condition, it was noticed that, you know what? This isn't necessarily food allergy. And sometimes those things correlate and sometimes they don't. It's a whole other story. And that's a whole other podcast we can get into. But it's still good to get that testing done. I think number one, make sure you know what the lay of that land is. And if that's negative and you're still seeing a lot of symptoms, that's when I think it's useful to do the sensitivity test. You and I were talking about the IgG food sensitivity test,
Yeah.
and that's going to usually be through a different type of provider, right?
Right.
You're like a naturopath or functional medicine. You're not probably not going to get your pediatrician or allergist to do it.
Yeah.
Um, you can go to websites like mymedlabs.com, I think, and order them for better or worse,
Hmm.
and then work with someone to interpret it. But what I really want to tell people is do not remove all the foods that show up. That is a fail.
It's
It
impossible.
literally
Yeah.
fails.
Yeah.
Um, so my kind of guidelines for when you remove an offending food is if it's life-threatening,
Yeah.
obviously, and you need to carry an EpiPen. If your kid eats it every single day and there's a reaction,
Yeah.
or if you just notice a big impact, which means mood, attention, sleep, if anything goes really off track because of that food, okay, we're going to replace it. It's not the end of the world.
And
Um,
my question for you, like around this, is like, you always hear about like some kids that outgrow, like quote
Mhm.
unquote, true allergies, but like,
Mhm.
do they outgrow, in your experience, do they outgrow these sensitivities and these intolerances, or sort of once they appear, like this is it for life?
Yeah. In my experience, I was meeting parents who'd already been tearing their hair out for for years.
Takes
So
a long
those were
time.
kids
Yeah.
who did not outgrow them.
Yeah.
And we needed to intervene. And again, it would always focus on what diet will we organize around this that's going to really nourish and replenish you without triggering, and how are we going to restore your gut function? And that would involve some looking and testing on where your microbiome is, whatever.
Yeah.
So yes and no. The kids who outgrew them, I guess, they don't need help. Uh,
Yeah.
but
Yeah. I just wonder if like, yeah.
to say that all kids will outgrow it, no, I
I
had a
don't,
pretty
I don't,
busy
I kind of,
practice.
yeah, that's sort of my, like, honestly, like, I feel like even if you go to the allergist and you're 3 and you get diagnosed with, like, let's say an egg allergy, like, I don't know, like, if that, I think there's something underlying your immune system has tagged eggs. Like, yes, you could probably get away with it, like, here and there, as you age sometimes. But I do think, like, or like maybe, yeah, I just think there's an underlying
For
thing that
sure.
stays with you. And it's
I
just, we
Yeah.
don't treat it that way. But I do think that there is something to that.
Yeah. I did see IgE reactions go away
Yeah.
in some kids, and I would say those seem more entrenched and require like a longer term strategy than
Yeah.
some of the IgG reactions in general.
Yeah.
But I do think those things are mutable, right?
Yeah.
They aren't set in stone. Is your kid going to just magically outgrow them? Maybe. But if it's troubling them and they're struggling, why wouldn't you just fix it? Or do
Yeah. Yeah.
right, do
Completely.
something to fix it. And
And
um,
yeah. And I think I think today a lot of parents don't even realize that like the fidgety, can't sit still, can't focus. Like I think they just like, oh, that's that my kid, that's his personality or her
yeah,
personality, right?
yeah. And then they're so stunned to meet a new kid when we start working
Oh
on
yeah. Oh yeah, the 2.0 phenomenon, right? It's like, oh, this is my kid 2.0, like a completely different person from like
yeah.
what we knew.
Yeah, and they're like, wow. And then, the kids are happier. Yes, there might be an elimination diet in the mix, but they're generally, I've had so many experiences where kids were happier, even if they were too little to like verbalize it.
Yeah, just
Um,
demeanor, disposition.
yeah,
I think resiliency, like the things that used to like upset them or frustrate them or set them off, it's just like a little smoother, like the
for
wrinkles are
sure.
kind of,
Kind of evens out.
evens out. And then I just will also flag that I find for anybody with skin conditions like eczemas, psoriasis, red inflamed, or the hives, like I find often that goes back to typically gluten. Um,
That's a common perp for
yeah,
sure.
yeah, gluten.
Yeah,
My
and
number one
it
is gluten, and if it's not gluten, it's typically dairy too.
Yeah, those are biggies. And I think again, secondary to they're just a huge part of kids' diets now. And I
Yeah.
think many, many kids have gut permeability issues. Um, gosh, I don't have this statistic at the tip of my tongue, but um, the percent of kids with a kind of we can't quite put a diagnostic label on it, GI condition now, I should pull that up, is quite high. And
Yeah.
it's not, did not used to be like that. So
Yeah.
yes, there's a whole new landscape of functional GI disorders and skin and allergy. Um, it did not used to be there. So
Well,
we're
right. Just,
yeah.
yeah. Even think about how allergies are handled today. Like every food product packaged in America has to list if you have a big eight, right? Listed,
Yeah.
in your
Right.
ingredients. Most schools, certainly peanut free, that's standard at this point, but many
Right.
will restrict, like you're not allowed to like bring in or even bake a treat for a child's birthday. You have to go to a
Right.
certain school approved bakery, you know what I mean? If you want to bring anything in. Um, So
Yeah.
I think the rise in general of reactions to food
Yeah,
has
it's definitely
changed.
a changed landscape for sure.
Yeah.
And, when I was a young mom, a new mom, and I had this baby with gut issues and skin issues, and we went to an allergist when my son was like 8 months old. It was like
Wow.
nobody did that then.
Yeah, a long time ago, right?
And the guy did skin prick testing all over us, and he was a mess, and his back was one big hive. And the allergist looked at me and said, I'm so sorry. He literally said, I'm so sorry, your son will have asthma.
Interesting. And
And
did he?
no.
Okay.
And I was like, hell no. I'm like, not on my watch.
Right.
And so that was, yeah, I just was like, no, there's more to the story than like just, oh, we're gonna give you these things. No, he never developed asthma. And we always worked with gut health, nutrition, and whatever we could to keep, even though he
Meant it.
needed an
Yeah.
elimination diet, and had for years that we did not go into the asthma
Because
club,
I think that is
thankfully.
common. I mean, I think asthma, allergies, oftentimes there's a lot of overlap.
There is, and I think my point being, you can move that needle with
Yeah.
food and nutrition and gut health. That's what I'm trying to say.
Yeah,
And
no, I totally agree.
yeah, and I think that's also one of my big tips for families is when you get sort of a handle on what are the immune reactions going on here? Is
Mhm.
it an MCAS story? Is it a histamine react? Try and get a handle on that. There are providers out there starting to recognize that. If you have to reach further than your MD allergist, that's okay. And some of them are starting to get on board with this and look a little deeper too.
Yeah.
Um, I'll make a plug. Am I allowed to do this? In where I am in the Rocky Mountain region on the Front Range of Colorado, there is a practice called Veros Health, and they take all insurances, they do pediatrics, they do all ages, and they do allergy and immunology, and they will do that kind of testing. So they're kind of at the cutting edge of it, which is great. If you
Yeah.
have a hospital system in your region that's reaching on that cutting edge, great. Then for sure, if you have coverage for that. Another tip I always would say is yes, you're going to need to work with that gut piece. And even if you're just starting with some probiotics, there are histamine degrading strains
Yeah.
that specifically will help your body break down too much histamine. It's Lactobacillus reuteri, Lactobacillus salivarius, and Lactobacillus rhamnosus are big on that.
Yeah.
There's some bifido strains that will do that. And, I would jump right into the 50 billion colony forming units dosed daily with kids, but
Yeah.
you need to find out if that's right for your child with your team. And as far as I mean, there's a whole, as I know, there's a whole world of supplements and things like that can help reduce histamines and these reactions. So of course the fish oils, the DHA fish oils, curcumin, turmeric, nettles, vitamin C, quercetin, these things work. You
Right.
you do need a lot of them. It's not like taking a Zyrtec once a day, right? But they can really be part of the team. And I
Yeah.
use that stuff a lot. And there are products made for children. There's a product called Dehist chewables for kids who can't swallow pills.
I
And
was
I
gonna
would,
say you can take, like they're teeny tiny, the
mhm.
histamine, degrading, like they'll help degrade histamine in your system.
Yeah,
I think digestive enzymes can go a long way too for
yeah.
a lot of different, kids who have food sensitivities. And I think just in general, just I'm looking at some stats here in front of me, like food allergies in children in the US have increased by 50% over the past 2 decades.
Whoa,
So in the
wow.
past 2 decades, something
That's
dramatic,
only 20 years ago.
correct.
I
That's
mean, go
not a
back to
long time.
1980 or
Uh,
85.
I'm sure it's a wild difference.
Yeah,
You know,
that's
and I
huge.
think for like we talked about the big eight, which is the ones that appear on like packaged foods, like that accounts for 90% of the issues in kids, whether it's
Oh,
peanut milk, shellfish, soy,
yeah.
dairy, like all that stuff, gluten.
Wow. Yeah, it's really daunting. It'd be really challenging. I mean, I know you and I want parents to know that you're not alone. If you're feeling overwhelmed and isolated with this, you have a lot of company. Like, um, yeah,
Yes.
we want to make sure that this is a really daunting challenge, but there's a lot of company out there and there's good places to get some good information. I've got a blog and you've got one.
Yeah.
Mine's moved over to Judy Converse Nutrition now.com and yours is up as well, right?
Like
Therese,
NadlerNutrition.com, cover a lot
Nadler
of different
Nutrition.
topics. And I
Yep.
also look, I think, really at environmental exposures too. So
Yes.
do you live near a golf course? There's a lot of spraying
Oh.
that goes on. Your lawn care, chemicals in the house, laundry detergent, dish detergent, soaps. I mean, your skin is one of your biggest
Mhm,
organs.
mhm, mhm.
So I think also looking, especially if you have a child who is showing like eczema, skin issues, I think there's a lot that you can do, from a food perspective, but also from an environmental perspective that can make a
Right.
really big
Yeah, and
difference.
for for eczema, I would often find too, in part of directing, what is this gut environment doing? What does it need? One of
Right.
my favorite tools was a GI map. I know they're
Correct.
expensive, but you get so much out of that one sample. A
Yeah.
nice snapshot of digestive status, inflammatory status, microbiome status. And with eczema, what I very frequently found is there'd be some typical microbes overburdening that gut environment.
Yeah.
Often they would be strep strains that just there in excess. And your child may not even have,
Active strep.
yeah, or no, not at all. Not, they wouldn't have active strep, and they may not have a big story with GI symptoms or features. But when we worked with reducing that part of the burden and building up more beneficial kind of um, the helpful
Strains.
microbe members and the ones that reduced histamine, the skin would start to clear. It could start to get a leg up. And
Yeah.
I know that seems like, what? How is your gut biome affecting your skin? But these things have to, like you said, skin is a huge organ. It's also an excretory organ in a way. Stuff
Yes.
has to get out. Your immune system's trying to manage these things. So giving it that balance can really help something like eczema.
Yeah, and I
Oh.
think also just in general, the skin is great for detox, and there's been a huge rise just I think in the adult world of the benefits of sauna. But for
Mhm.
children, my version of that is like Epsom salt baths. Same
Yeah,
concept. You know what I mean?
right,
Like you're not going to put your 4-year-old in a sauna for half an
right,
hour.
right,
Good luck with that if you try it. Don't do that at home. Don't.
right.
Um, but I think an Epsom salt bath 2 or 3 times a week can also help with detox. Very
Sure.
soothing, relaxing.
Yep. And
Um,
there's a lot of sulfur in that, of
yep,
course, which is a key component of glutathione, which is a big detox molecule that we make. So
yep,
feeding that can really help.
correct.
It's legit.
It's legit, and also
Yeah.
there are, like, little mouth sprays that you can take, and, like, honestly, little kids, it doesn't taste bad, it's just, like, a quick pump or 2 in the morning, and that helps. Liposomal glutathione can be very helpful, master detoxifier in the body,
Hmm. Hmm.
with kids, trying to help them. Um, but I mean, the one thing I will say, I do feel with like a lot of allergies or insensitivities and things like that, you can certainly manage them. I do think though, with like peanut allergies and tree nut allergies, that is like a different level for certain people who are affected,
Yes. Yeah.
and
Yeah.
that is something to just be aware of. I think most people are at
Absolutely.
this point,
Yeah.
but
Don't mess with it.
you don't mess with it, and that typically people do not outgrow that. When you have that, that is
Hmm.
something that stays with you
Yeah.
for life.
It can persist. That IgE number may fluctuate some up and down.
Yeah.
Um, and if you think, oh, it's looking good, can we test it? You can do that for sure in your MD allergist office,
Yeah,
as I'm sure a lot of parents know who've been down this road. You can sit there in the office and do a test in front of, and they'll have the tools right there ready to
manage, right?
arrest a reaction
Yeah,
if it happens. So you don't need to go tinkering alone at home to see
right.
if it's now safe to eat one of these foods. That's definitely a good appointment to make if you're thinking about reintroducing a food. And yeah, allergies do go away. And one thing I know we haven't talked about is the sublingual, what's it called? Sublingual therapy, where over time, allergists will put a tiny dose of the trigger under your tongue. It's
Yep.
called slit for short. I forget what the I stands for. I did not see a lot of success with that in I didn't, it's not part of my practice. It's what your MD allergist can do.
Yeah.
I'd be curious to hear if any families have seen great success. The feedback that I often got was it seemed to work really well for inhaled allergens like ragweed, grass, whatever,
Yeah.
dogs, cats,
People have
pollen, but
mentioned.
not so great for food. And I'm not sure if that's your experience or not. But
Yeah.
there are some new things out there. And what's interesting is that's the same concept as homeopathy. It's just in a very different dosing level.
Yeah.
So really interesting how we're kind of circling back to these older ideas. Homeopathy
Yep.
being a modality where you give, and critics will say there's no actual substance in the dose of homeopathic that you give, which is technically true, but we don't go into that esoteric why it still works. But slit therapy, slit might work well for your child if they have a mixture of inhaled allergens and food allergies. Anything you can do to remove some of the burden for the immune system is going to help it
Right.
focus, organize, calm your kid down.
And I think this is also the emphasis on the gut microbiome, right? 70% of the immune system resides in the gut.
Right.
So if your child is reacting, we have to understand what's happening in the gut and clean that up and get it to a better spot because that often
Hmm.
will help resolve some of these situations. And I like the idea of homeopathy. I don't know a ton about it, but I know that the idea is like begets like, basically,
Right. Right. It's interestingly, it's really the same philosophy or whatever you want to call that rule as we use for vaccination. You get a hair
Right,
of the dog, so to
right. A
speak.
little bit to help
Mhm.
kind of,
Yeah.
put it in
Yeah,
the
and
system. Yeah.
it's a very fascinating modality. If you're interested in that, talk with a what's called a classical homeopath. They're trained. There are people trained in this, and I can attest that it's a very powerful, it can be a very potent. So don't like mess with it. Like if
Yeah.
you really want to use it for some deeper chronic problems, yeah, talk with a classical homeopath. I'm all interested in for that. I've seen many amazing outcomes with that, which are inexplicable. I don't need to understand if I'm seeing it in
To
front of
believe
my
it.
face, what is going on.
Yeah.
I'm curious. It's great to dig deeper into it, but I'm not going to reject it if I see it really helping. There are tools parents can use in what are called lower potencies for just day-to-day problems. And I used those as a parent when my son was growing up. Great help, kept us out of the doctor's office many, many times. We'd resolve an issue quickly with a
Oh,
homeopathic. And there's some great resources out on just sort of home remedies like that. But yeah, for these deep-seated long-term allergy issues, if we had a classical homeopath, and maybe that would be a fun podcast.
I'd be very
Yeah,
interested in
they
that
would
because I,
tell you you
yeah,
can treat that with homeopathy, I would expect.
yeah,
That's interesting. We should think
yeah,
about that.
yeah. No, I totally agree because I feel like what's old is new.
Yeah,
Like you were saying, like things are coming back, and I think people are going back to sort of ancient and older remedies. Because again, like the current medical system and the reliance on drugs and creams and things that like, you do it a couple times and you're like, this is just not working.
yeah,
And so you
yeah,
just give up and you start looking in other directions.
right, right.
So yeah, I think that would actually
Yeah.
be a great idea.
Well, interesting. This is a big topic and allergy reaches into kind of every other system, of course,
Yes.
because your whole body, it's not like just one little part of your body is thinking it
No.
has allergy. It's communicating all across your body.
Yeah.
So yeah, it definitely overlaps big with nutrition, food, and gut for sure.
Yeah. Great. All right. Well, this was awesome. I think we have our takeaway for potentially another podcast topic here.
Again.
Uh, but we will get this out there. And of course, if you have any topics, anyone has topics they want us to cover, they want to learn more about, please get in touch. We'd love to hear from you and we will
Love
make it
it.
happen.
Yeah, thank you.
All right. See you next time.